The Luck Child. Not so long ago, here in the deep north, where it can be so cold just very cold is considered quite warm, two dark hearts ruled the land. One beat cold in a cruel king, and the other in a terrible beast, a griffin. And it happened in a week with 2 Fridays that the cruel king heard of a prophecy. A child had been born, reported his spies, a luck child, poor as penance, rich as snow, the 7th son of a 7th son. Wise men prophesied this child would one day be king and claim all the riches of the realm. Superstition, Majesty, folklore, advised his evil chancellor. Old wives' tales. How could a peasant's child, not worth a spit, how could a brat become king? But the cruel king choked on the news, could not swallow it, felt it sharpen and pierce his heart. So he vowed a cold vow the boy would not live to see the snow melt and the summer come. And before dawn he set out with his chancellor to find this luck child and do him in. Now the boy they sought was indeed a humble child. Even as they rode, king and chancellor, through the bleak hills and barren lands of the realm, even as they planned their wicked wiles, a tiny infant was at his mother's chest. Gifts came for him, scraps of food, thin shawls, a blanket, for folk in these parts knew of the blessing of a 7th son to a 7th son and honored it. And joy warmed the simple hut where his mother lay and his father watched and his brothers slept. The luck child's sweet smile echoed in the room from mother to father, from brother to brother, and they lacked nothing except the full belly and the wherewithal to fill it. A harsh knocking broke the cold silence. The father went to the door and opened it to the weather. Standing there, he saw 2 men hooded against the wind, fur framing their faces. "We come in search of the luck child," said one of them sternly, peering in at the cradle. "Is this him?" The father said it was indeed, so that in those parts they counted such a child as lucky, although they had nothing in the way of fortune for him. One of the men dipped into his cloak and produced a purse. From it he took a thick gold piece and held it up for them to see. The last flickers of fire caught the gold, and it sparkled. Husband and wife had never seen gold. Neither spoke. The man shook the purse, which jingled. "My master here, a good man, brings 7 pieces like this," he declared, the gold jingling in evidence. "He seeks a child to patron and to care for." At this the second man stepped forward, face in shadows, and nodded. "As if he were my own son," he said quietly. The first stranger explained their mission. They would swap the 7 gold pieces for the luck child. He and his master stood impatient, while husband looked to his wife, and then both looked sadly to the floor. "It's a bargain, I take it? Yes or no?" Finally, the mother spoke in a small voice. "He's my little boy," she said, not looking at the strangers and their bag of gold, but pleadingly at her husband. The first man dismissed this with a wave of his hand. "You have 6 others, mother," he said curtly, "and now they'll be plump as pigs." The mother wept. Her baby began to cry. "He's my little lover," she whispered, and held the tiny bundle to her. The first man sighed. "Well, of course," he said in a sour voice, "you must have more gold to comfort yourself," and dug into his pockets for a second purse. "'Tis not more gold me misses wants," said her husband, standing by her and placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "You can't put gold to your chest. You can't hear its heart beat." At this the strangers dropped their guise of generosity. The evil chancellor, for it was he, addressed the father in his real voice, a poisonous hiss. "Please yourselves," he hissed. "You've had your chance." And so saying, he turned to his master, the cruel king. "I'll send in men on the morrow," he told him, "and turn the snow bloody." And the father heard these terrible words, and had fear for his family, who one by one had clung to him and to each other, threatened by the two hooded strangers. He looked at his wife, hugging the precious baby. They could say nothing, but their hearts spoke. What could they do but sacrifice the one for the sake of the others? What could they hope but that these tall men with their rich furs and bags of gold would take the child and care for him, hoarding his luck? The father bent down to his wife, and gently unclasped her hands from the baby, kissed his tiny forehead, and gave him to the chancellor. "We'll hand over our little boy to your safe keeping," he said sadly. The chancellor snatched the baby away, tossed the purse into the empty cradle, and headed for the door. "Look after him!" cried the father, "because he's a little precious, you see! The seventh son of the seventh son! He's a luck child!" The two men hurried out, left no words of comfort behind them. The door, flung open in their wake, chilled the room. And that was that. Husband looked at wife, who looked at children. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. No one spoke for a long time. In the silence the cradle swung, jingling the gold pieces. Had it been filled to the brim with gold, it could not have comforted them. Outside, the two men rode on through the bitter cold, while the snow pinched and punched and slapped at their faces. On they went, their grim hearts set, until they came at length to where the black cliffs traced the edge of the kingdom, a dreadful drop from land to sea. They left their horses and hastened to the brink, the chancellor carrying the luck-child in his arms. And after looking down to watch the waves crash against the rocks below, the chancellor turned to the king, shouting to be heard, "The fall will finish him, or the icy waves!" Oblivious to this terrible scheme, the luck-child smiled, a charming smile that touched even the king's hard heart. "That's a nice smile," he said in a troubled voice. "I'd smile too," returned the chancellor, reminding him of the prophecy. "Given your kingdom, given your gold, given all that is rightfully yours." "Would you?" the king asked sharply. The chancellor caught his suspicion, and was at pains to explain. "I wouldn't, sire," he insisted, scrape and grovel. I mean he would. I speak of him." The king nodded, eyes narrowing. "I can't look," he said, pointing to the drop. How far down is it?" The chancellor bent over the edge to estimate. As he did so, the king placed a boot on his back and kicked him over the brink, sending him flying into space, dropping like a stone, the baby with him, hurtling into the black jaws, the infant's shawls unwinding as they fell, a white flag unfurling in the darkness. "That's right!" cried the king. "You go too, sir! No one will share my crown!" And he shook his fist in the air in triumph, his own roar merging with the chancellor's as he crashed to the ground, the rocks and waves rushing up to meet him. And the cruel king turned and went back to his horse, his heart pounding at the deed. The baby done for, the prophecy denied. But had the king looked, had the king watched, the sneer would have left his lips. For the baby fell. Oh yes, he plummeted down, dropping into the dark, the sea roaring below, the black rocks beckoning. Oh yes, he plunged downward. But remember, this was a luck child. The shawl caught on a jutting rock and wound round, pulling the baby up short before dropping him gently down onto the shore. Sand, soft, safe. The evil chancellor fared less well. The sea had him. As for the cold king, the days went by, and from time to time he thought of the luck-child, and felt a little bad, a tiny bad, a fleeting bad. But soon he quite forgot what he'd done out of fear of a prophecy. Besides, it wasn't long before he had a baby of his own, a little girl. She sought out the one soft part of his heart and touched it. How he loved his little darling! And as the years passed, 10, 12, 15, 16, the daughter turned out to be a beauty, a lovely, a princess talked of, longed for. And the offers? Hundreds! But the king was vexed. He didn't want her married. He wasn't going to lose her in a hurry, or his money, or his jewels, or his castles, or his crowns, or the things he wouldn't even mention in case anyone stole them. Hands off! Hands off all my lovelies! Greed grew in him like a canker until he could enjoy nothing, until he would not count his gold for fear of rubbing it away with his fingers. Instead, he traveled his kingdom, inspecting harvests, collecting taxes, and worrying each farthing into the royal coffers, and always the king wanted more. So it was one day that he came to a mill busy with the reckoning of the crop. All morning the men had come, tugging their carts loaded with their year's harvest, knowing that for every sack they might keep, the king would take 2. Inside, the miller ground the grain while his son wrote the figures in a ledger. And though much was given away, enough was kept, for the sun and the rain had come that year in plenty, and the harvest was good. So spirits were high, and the miller's wife went among the men with a cup of cider and a heel of bread. And who didn't sing clapped, and who didn't clap laughed, and all was merry. Then the trumpets of the king sounded as he approached, and the mill fell silent. In he swept, glaring at the gathered sacks, noting the big pile that was his, and begrudging the small piles that were not. All bowed and cowered at his entrance, save for the miller's son, a handsome youth with golden hair, who remained at his seat as the king strode toward him. "I am in your region inspecting harvests," announced the king. "How goes it?" The miller's son smiled. "Fair, sir," he said pleasantly, and handed over the ledger. The king checked each entry with a sour eye, his finger running down the list. "Am I cheated?" he demanded suspiciously. "I will not be cheated." The boy shook his head. "No, sire," he told the king, and then continued in a bold voice, for he was a brave fellow. "I have counted each tithe and entered it. Your people sweat for each ear of wheat, each cob of corn." The miller chimed in anxiously. "And your majesty also needs his tithes, of course." The king glowered at them. "That's right," he said threateningly. But the miller's son was undaunted. "That's right," he echoed, smiling the while. "Otherwise, we'd all be lords and no king, and then what?" All around the mill, the peasants, still kneeling, shrank back at this daring and waited for the king's response. The king walked over to the miller. A shadow crept across his brain, nagging. "How come this boy is fair-skinned," he asked suspiciously, "when you are dark?" The miller coughed nervously, glancing at his wife. Before he had time to reply, his son answered for him. "I'm a foundling, sire," he said easily. The shadow over the king deepened. He stared at the boy, his eyes fixed on the smile, wondering why he felt he'd seen that smile 1,000 times before, in his dreams, in his waking thoughts. "Found where?" he demanded. "Found when?" The miller placed a protective arm around his son. "By the Black Cliffs," he mumbled, his voice faltering. 17 years since. Washed up without a scrap on his little body." The king's heart began to race. "You're a lucky one, then," he said. Father and mother nodded, relieved. "That's what we call him," said the miller enthusiastically. "Lucky." Now the king knew the worst. Knew where the shadow had come from, knew why the smile had haunted him. He gasped, hardly able to catch his breath from his thumping heart, for he knew the boy must be the one born to claim his throne. The luck child. "Kill him," thumped his heart. "Kill him, kill him, kill him." Biting on his lip, the king stared at Lucky. "A boy like you would do well at court," he said. Lucky's face fell. "I am needed here, sire." "Then you'll be missed," snorted the king, turning to the parents. "I'll take the boy. With that, and brooking no disagreement, he took pen and paper and began to write. "Take this to the Queen," he instructed Lucky. "It's a royal warrant. She'll welcome you into our care." After sealing the paper, he handed it to Lucky and left, as he had left once before, stealing a child from its parents. His page stepped forward. "Hurrah for the king!" he cried, a sharp look requiring agreement. "Hurrah for the king!" the parents chorused. "Hurrah for the king!" So that night, the luck child, after 17 years of peace and happiness, strode off alone on his royal errand, oblivious to his own true identity, oblivious to the king's foul designs, oblivious to all save the sorrow in his heart, the sad farewells to his mother and father, the past behind him, the adventure ahead. He clutched the royal warrant and pushed on, but there was many a mile between mill and palace, many a forest, and Lucky had no horse or map. The night settled on his head like a huge cloth, and he was very soon lost. He went round in circles, hungry and tired, missing the harvest dance and the cider and the pretty village girls. Head fuddled, he plunged once more into the trees. But a man on foot could not fathom this place. Folk went in, but few came out. And foul things lived there. Owls hooted, branches rustled, the wind moaned, and things slid and slithered underfoot. Lucky shivered, pressing on, full of courage, until suddenly, without warning, the ground gave way beneath him, and before he knew it, he was falling for the second time in his short life, down and down and down. Lucky was in a hole that sucked him up, pulling him into its stomach. He dropped for what seemed like minutes, and then crashed, smashed, and dashed on the bottom. Dazed and bewildered, Lucky opened his eyes to a strange sight. He was in a cave, an inch from a bubbling cauldron, and all around him as he peered into the dim light he saw treasures and trophies piled on the ground. A voice from nowhere made him jump in surprise. "Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear," it said. Lucky turned, searching for the speaker, but saw nothing. "Oh dear," the voice repeated, and Lucky looked down and saw the smallest man he had ever laid eyes on, a tiny, bearded, shifty chap with darting eyes and a little skipping shuffle. Oh dear," he continued regretfully. "You've fallen in among thieves. This is a robber's cave, a terrible place." Lucky explained that he was on royal business and showed the little man his letter from the king. The little man shook his head and looked anxiously about him. "I see," he muttered. "Oh dear. Are you hungry?" Lucky looked about him, searching for an exit, but there didn't seem to be one, save the endless hole from whence he had come. He turned to the little man, too late to catch him add a dash of white powder to the bowl of steaming stew he had dished out. "It's goulash," announced the man, handing him the bowl, producing an old bent spoon, which he huffed and polished on his filthy apron. The stew smelled delicious, piping hot. "Thanks," said Lucky, accepting it with relish. "I'm supposed to be Lucky. That's my name, Lucky. But I don't seem very—" And that was as far as he got, for a single spoonful of the little man's goulash sent him reeling to the floor in a stupor, spoon and bowl scattering with a clatter. "That's it!" the little man shrieked, hovering over Lucky's drugged body. "I'm the cook, also the poisoner, also the nastiest." And with that he set about searching the boy for money. But he was disappointed. Lucky had nothing, only his royal warrant poking from his pocket. With a tut and a cluck and an irritated hiss, the little man snatched up the letter and broke the seal with his knife. "A letter from the king, eh?" he muttered. "Well, this'll never reach the palace. Oh, no, your luck's run out. Oh, dear me, yes." So muttering, he sat on a rock and began to read. The little man could not believe his eyes. "Terrible! What a terrible letter!" he announced. And this is what the letter said. "Wife," it began, "when you read this letter, order the bearer of it, a youth named Lucky, to be chopped into 1,000 pieces. Do this without delay. King." The little man was outraged. "This is disgusting," he declared, and regarded Lucky with pity. "Poor fellow," he said, all heart and sympathy. "We'll soon see about this." Now he was also a forger, this little man. Full of fair play, he sat down to write a new letter. Oh yes, he sat with his wax and his quill and a ready will and practised the king's sly script until even the old cold monarch himself could have seen no difference. And then he began to write. So it was the next morning, and the luck child woke refreshed and restored, and, remarkably, with the palace straight ahead of him. Very odd, he thought, but off he set without much more ado, blessing his luck and brandishing the letter with the royal seal. He didn't see the little man watching from the woods, a benign smile on his little lips, a gleeful twinkle in his little eyes. Lucky blessed his luck and hurried on, hole, cave, and goulash fading from his mind as he viewed the finery before him. "I have a letter from His Majesty!" he cried at the drawbridge. In he went to find the Queen sitting stitching at the open window, and in a chair beside her, weaving at a loom, with eyes like sapphires, smile like heaven, hair like silk, and skin like satin, was the princess, her daughter. And the thing happened straight off. Lucky looked at the princess looked at Lucky, and that was it. Love. Oh yes, as the perplexed queen greeted this unlikely youth and opened her husband's letter, Lucky quite forgot where he was or who he was or why he was there, and dropped into the deep for a third time, dropped into the sapphire lakes of the princess's eyes. The queen, meanwhile, read and reread the letter in her hand, her glasses falling from her nose. "Gracious!" she cried. "Well, gracious me!" A week later, the king was on his journey home. He gloated on the gold, on the riches squeezed from the poor. But it was not the wealth he was dragging home that drew the sneer across his evil face. No, it was relish. He was savoring his cruel deed, savoring the luck child in bits. He rode along, contemplating the boy in 1,000 pieces. How many pieces to a hand, he wondered, to an ear? A mile from the palace, he heard bells. A party of bells. A delirium of bells. He could not hear for bells. He called for his men to investigate, but they could not hear him for bells, and at the edge of the palace, hundreds of people cheering, or so he guessed. He could not hear the cheers for bells ringing, but their happiness was clear in the sea of flags, waving, dancing, and then, looking up to the battlements, the king saw something, and he couldn't believe it. For framed on the royal balcony, waving down to the crowd, the queen smiling behind them, stood the princess and Lucky, both in white and lace, hand in hand, strewn with confetti. A noise came out of the king's mouth. A howl, a cry of rage, rage, rage. His heart thumped, his veins popped out of his neck, his face went puce, then purple, then thunderously dark. "Oh!" he howled. "Oh!" His daughter, his future, his precious treasure, standing there embracing the luck child for all to see. "How? How? How?" he howled, but no one listened. "How?" he demanded of the queen as he burst into the court. His wife hurried toward him, equally bewildered. "You ordered it!" she cried. "I ordered him to be chopped into 1,000 pieces." He read the letter the queen thrust at him. There it was, in his own hand. The luck child must marry the princess. "Marriage," ordered his handwriting. "Do this without delay. King." The king's head sagged. The letter slipped from his grasp and floated to the floor. His head filled up with the words of the prophecy, repeating over and over like a spell. The luck child will one day be king. The luck child will one day be king. He couldn't shut the words from his mind. The luck child will one day be king. The princess saw her father and rushed in from the balcony. "Father!" she cried, leaping into his arms. "We're so happy!" And following on, looking every inch the prince, came her husband, the luck child. "Majesty," he began humbly, kneeling in front of the king, "forgive me. I had thought you a cruel tyrant, a blight on the poor. But now you make this humble peasant your son and heir and the happiest husband there ever was." The cold king couldn't look at him. He turned away, his brain grasping and clutching. Then it came to him. The solution, the only solution. A thin smile creased his mouth. His eyes glinted. "And the golden feather?" he asked innocently. Lucky was confused. "Beg pardon?" "The golden feather from the Griffin," the king said impatiently. "Do you not have it?" The princess looked at her mother in horror. "No, sire," said Lucky. "Then you must fetch it," the king told him, his smile thickening into a sneer. "Was it not understood that my daughter could not marry without it?" "But that's impossible!" cried the princess, clinging to her husband. "The Griffin is a monster! It eats people! It's terrible!" "She's right," said the queen sadly. "Oh, yes, she's right," thought the king. "I have him now. Now I have him." "Yes," he agreed aloud. "It won't be easy, but then not every man is fit to marry my daughter. That is the condition, the Griffin's golden feather." "Very well," said Lucky with a deep breath, and though the princess wept, though the queen sorrowed, though the king smirked, he strode boldly to the door. "Don't worry," he told them, gathering up his courage. "I'll come back." But the princess wept and wept. "No one has ever come back," she wept. "We'll see," said her husband defiantly, and without more ado set off in search of the golden feather from the tail of the Griffin. Off he marched, the luck child, his chin a determined jut. To the Griffin, he told himself, to the Griffin. It became a direction when he had none, a distance when he knew none. "What do you seek?" folk asked him. "The Griffin." "How far do you travel?" "To the Griffin." And he paid no heed to the warnings, the weeping at his folly. No, he marched on. With each month his resolve strengthened. With each mile the land got poorer. Green gave way to dust. On. No lush, no life. The black deserts of the Griffin. On and on he trudged, until one day he came to a lake where no fish swam. And in the middle of the lake was an island, and in the middle of the island was the shattered lair of the Griffin. Lucky looked and was dazzled, for the island was pitted with jewels, the shore dusted with gold. It sparkled, cold as flint, on the black mirrors of the water, and a fine mist rose around it, and crept to the far bank where Lucky stood wondering how he might cross. Soon he could see nothing at all, the mist enveloping him. A curlew called, and then Lucky heard a bell, a handbell chiming sorrowfully across the water, sounding nearer and nearer, bringing with it the dim shape of a boat, a small craft steered by a tall, stooping figure. "Ho there, ferryman!" called Lucky. "Will you take me across?" The boat slid into the shore, and there before him was the oldest man Lucky had ever seen. His white hair and white beard engulfed him, leaving only the eyes dark and haunted, and the mouth pale and wan. "I go across, back and forth ceaselessly, with you or without you," said the ferryman in the voice of funerals. And Lucky barely had enough time to step onto the boat before the old man did indeed push away from the bank and set off slowly into the mist. "I seek the Griffin," Lucky told him, holding on to the sides of the narrow craft. the ferryman poling sadly through the waveless water. The ferryman simply nodded and said nothing. Lucky peered into the mist, the world silent save the steady rise and fall of the oar. The island loomed before them, the jewels shimmering. "Such jewels," sighed Lucky, "such riches!" "No one brings them back," replied the ferryman, his own voice shrouded in gloom, his head bowed wearily. "I shall," announced the boy, determined. "I shall come back." The ferryman shook his white head, the eyes hollow. "Ah," he murmured, "if you do, perhaps you will discover why I must continue this weary way, back and forth, without ending. For I am tired and sick to my soul." And so saying, the ferryman reached the opposite bank, and Lucky leapt off the boat, all youth and courage. "I'll remember," he promised, and turned to wave, but already the craft had set off again, sliding into the mist, the ferryman's bowed head slowly vanishing. For each one who came, the same tale. The Griffin, pleas for love, for justice, for fame, for fortune, but always in the end for the Griffin's supper. The ferryman turned and pushed down his oar away from the bank, not wanting to hear the boy's cries, the splintering bones. Lucky walked into the Griffin's ruined domain. The great beast had ripped open the roof, smashing through the stone and timbers, turning what had once been a palace into a vast, filthy nest, lined with muck and bones and things spat out. A dark, dank, damp stench overwhelmed Lucky as he wandered the hall. Lucky shivered as the cold air whistled through the rafters, and he looked up at the black night and the moon above his head. Evil hung over him like foul breath, and for the first time in his brave life he knew what fear was. A scampering noise startled him as he jumped around, dagger at the ready. "Oh dear," said a familiar voice. Lucky couldn't believe it. Looking up at him was the ragtag and darting-eyed little man. Lucky was relieved and delighted, and said so at once, embracing the little man and wondering what on earth he was doing there. And the little man told him that the Griffin had smashed open the cave and carried him away. His cooking had saved him, he explained, and now he was a servant for the terrible monster. And then Lucky said he'd come for the golden feather. The little man's face fell. "Impossible," he told Lucky, "impossible." But Lucky had come too far to hear these words again. He'd made a solemn promise to his wife. By hook or by crook, fair means or foul, he had to have the feather. The little man scratched his little ragged head and sent clouds of lice buzzing angrily about him. "Hide under the table," he told the boy, "and I'll do what I can." Lucky hugged him with glee and made for the table, crouched under it, then popped his head out. "I must also discover how the poor ferryman can cease his ceaseless crossing." Before the little man could reply, a huge shadow threw the hall into darkness, and high above them they heard a dreadful beating of wings. "Quick, quick!" urged the little man, and Lucky dived back under the table. As the furious beating grew louder, the little man scampered to the kitchen, where an enormous pot of goulash simmered, and added the entire contents of his sleeping herbs, enough to send an army to sleep. Then, with a terrifying thump on the door in the hall, causing dust and bones to jump and shudder, the Griffin arrived. The beast that filled the banquet hall struck fear into folks' hearts and haunted their dreams. Misbehaving children were threatened with his name. The sight of him flying through the clouds sent strong men screaming for safety. The Griffin was immense. His massive head, half lion, half dragon, sat on the body of a giant golden eagle. His claws could rip a tree from its roots. His wings could slap down a house. He was neither good nor bad, not knowing the meaning of the words. He was simply hungry, always hungry, and when he was hungry, his rage was horrible. Lucky could only see the Griffin's talons. They had landed by him, crushing an abandoned skull into dust. He shrank into the shadows of the table and waited. The Griffin threw back his head, his huge nostrils heaving like bellows. "My sniff, snuff, snaw, man whiff!" he complained, snorting. The little man appeared, dragging the steaming pot of goulash. "Of course you can smell a man!" he cried cheerily. "That's me!" The Griffin shook his head, his wings restless. "No!" he said dangerously. "Snuffle, snort, other sort!" Lucky tried to make himself invisible, while the little man fussed and soothed the Griffin, clucking and cooing and stirring the pot. At the sight of the food, the Griffin's beak unclamped, and a cavern of a mouth appeared, a mouth big enough to eat a house. "I could eat a house!" said the Griffin, and with that he dipped his beak into the goulash, and within seconds the cauldron was licked clean, goulash and sleeping herbs sucked into the bottomless stomach. The little man watched carefully, but the potion seemed to have no effect on the monster. The Griffin let loose an enormous belch, a gust of goulash smothering his cook. "Burpo!" cried the Griffin, and he then demanded a scratch, as was his custom. "Scritch, itch, scrutch, scratch'll he!" he demanded, and the little man clambered onto his back to oblige. The Griffin loved to be scratched. He twisted and turned and arched and purred, while the little man ran his nails through his feathers. "Meh, yay!" he sighed, delirious. The little man preened away, working his way up towards the single golden feather on his back. He tugged at it. "Yeah!" roared the Griffin and reared up, his wings suddenly flapping with a horrible violence. The little man clung on for dear life. "I know," he cried desperately. "Clumsy! I'm clumsy! I've scratched too hard!" "Yeah!" sulked the Griffin, but he would not let the little man stop. "No!" he ordered. "Scritch, scritch, scratch'll he!" And so the little man did, obediently working at the feathers until he felt the monster relax. Once again he took the golden feather in his hand and pulled on it. "Rah!" cried the Griffin, and before he could avoid it, the little man found his face sandwiched within the Griffin's beak, a gulp away from joining the goulash. I'm sorry, he moaned, his head as fragile as an egg. Oh dear, oh dear." "Me not likes things pulled," said the Griffin. The little man tried to nod his head, but couldn't. "No, that's right," he agreed. "You're a sensitive monster." The Griffin was briefly pacified. "Rah!" he said, then thought of it. "Not monsto!" "Beastie!" tried the little man. The Griffin shook his beak in disgust, opening his wings to crush the little man against the table with a single claw. In the commotion, the little man managed to grasp and hang on to the golden feather, so that as the Griffin reared up, it came away in his hand. He dropped it as he lay prostrate on the table, the Griffin's claw pinning him casually, talons 3 inches into the wood. In a flash, Lucky shot out his arm, gathered up the feather, and retreated back under the table. "Me bird!" insisted the Griffin, oblivious to all this. "He misunderstood bird, he not beastie!" The little man could hardly breathe. "Of course you are," he insisted. "A bird, a very nice bird. I should go. I should go back to where I came from, to that dark, horrid cave. Serve me right." "No!" roared the Griffin, prodding him. The little man gasped for air, the claw all but smothering him. "Don't try and stop me," he gasped. "I'll tell that old ferryman to row me across. Yes, he's outside now, I expect, waiting for a passenger." He gasped again. "I'll go. Poor fellow, why is he always there? Why can't he leave?" The Griffin threw back his head dismissively. "Is cursed the worst and stays the same, lest someone take Po, and then someone cursed aways the same him. Simpo!" Underneath the table, Lucky, clutching the golden feather, listened hard to this, but understood nothing. "So if someone took the pole from him," asked the little man, more familiar with the Griffin's curious expressions, "they'd have to row, and he'd be free. So simple. I should go and tell that poor fellow. I should take over. Really, I should go now and take over. As he said this, wriggling to escape the griffin's suffocating claw, the misunderstood bird relaxed his grip while a massive yawn overcame him. "No!" he exclaimed, yawning. His claw slipped away from the table, and his wings stretched in tiredness. "Go to sleep now," said the little man, scampering free. "Busy day ahead, eating people and wreaking havoc." The griffin laughed and yawned all at once, the sleeping draught muddling through his thoughts. "Yea, now then," he said wearily. The little man stroked the griffin's beak as it slumped on the table, eyelids drooping. "That's it," he said. "Nestle down now. Snoozy-woozies. Nesso." And in a second the lids dropped shut, and the griffin was asleep, his head rolling over and crushing the little man again, his nostrils puffing in and out peacefully. At the first sound of the griffin's steady snore, Lucky crept out from under the table, brandishing the golden feather, beaming with delight. The little man whispered to him to be very quiet, and then, as Lucky stole forward to help disentangle him from the snoozing griffin, he shook his little head, patted the griffin affectionately, and told Lucky to go, take care, stay lucky. And so he did, leaving the huge griffin and the little man unlikely companions in the fated evening. Off the luck child scurried, clutching the golden feather, scooping up jewels, scooping up gold. Straight home he wanted to go, straight home to happiness. He waited impatiently at the bank for the sorrowful bell of the ferryman. As he pulled slowly forward through the mist, the old man could hardly credit what he saw. But there he was, the smiling youth, leaping onto the boat as it turned and headed to the opposite shore. "I dare not think it possible you have the answer," he asked, his white head shaking. "But then you did come back. No one has ever come back." "Well, I have come back," said Lucky triumphantly, "and I do have the answer." And this is what he told him. "The next passenger you have, hand him your oar. Then your luck will be his freedom yours." The ferryman's eyes misted over. "By handing him the oar?" Lucky nodded, beaming. "That's it," he confirmed. "Simple." The old ferryman was moved to tears. "So simple," he sobbed, remembering 1,000 crossings, 1,000,000 crossings, an age of crossings. "So simple," he said, and the tears ran from him. And for the first time in years, centuries, hope fired the ferryman, because, for all the tears, a smile was forming in his mind, a tiny smile growing, getting ready to be born. The king was in his counting-house, smelling his money, when a trumpet sounded a fanfare. A great cheer went up on the ramparts and battlements. The king was paralyzed. The cheering grew louder, the bells started up again, and he forced himself to the window. He knew what he would see below. His page burst into the room. "He's come back!" he cried. The cold king's heart thumped and thumped. In rushed the queen, her face alight. "He's come back!" His head throbbed. In came the princess, and before she could speak, her husband, the luck child, appeared, brandishing his trophy. "I've come back," he cried, "and I've got the golden feather." He had done as bidden, and the king could do nothing but agree, and gave his blessing. "You have my blessing," he said, though it cost him dear in his bitter heart. Then Lucky, his smile torturing the king, pulled open a chest loaded with treasure from the Griffin's island. The king whimpered, his eyes popping, while the boy, his arm embracing his darling wife, explained his adventure. "I took a ferry across the lake to where the Griffin lives. On the other shore, gold lies where pebbles should, emeralds where sand, and where the sea breaks, diamonds fall." The treasure burned into the king's eyes, the want welling in him until he was giddy. "Lucky," he mumbled, swallowing, swaying, skin turning hot and cold. "So lucky." But even as he spoke, The poison swilling in his eyes, souring his mouth, the king vowed to go himself to the Black Lake. Greed will be my guide, he told himself, gold my map. That very night he slipped away alone, leaving his daughter and the Luck-child to their joy, and came hence to the very lake described to him thus. From out of the mist came a sad tolling bell, and following the bell, a boat and a figure dressed in all black rowing, eager to offer passage without thought of pay. Slowly the king and the ferryman set across the lake, the slowest trip in all the thousands the ferryman had set. "Faster!" the king demanded. "Faster! Faster!" "Faster, you say?" "Yes, blast it all, faster! Can't you row any faster?" Without words, the ageless one cautiously removed the oar from the water, and held it out gently with 2 hands for his passenger to take. "Perhaps you would like a try?"